There's lots of different types of woodland in Britain, some of which are pretty much native and some of which have been changed in some way by our activities. I suppose all of them have been influenced by people, but it's the degree that they've had a non-native species planted into them that probably makes the most significant difference. So this woodland that I'm in now is one which is part native and part non-native trees, and we're on the edge of a big valley area. We're not up in the mountains, but we are in the hills. And here they've planted a mix of native broadleaf trees, actually also some non-native broadleaf trees, because, for example, beech aren't particularly native in this area, they're more of a southern species, and then also the conifers. And what happened is, in around the 17 and 1800s, it became more and more popular to plant more conifers, because as people were collecting plants from around the world, they were finding trees and putting them into arboretums and into forest areas, and I realised that they could get nice, clean, straight timber from these non-native trees, so they started planting them in. But they often would keep this mixed forest as well, because that was good for keeping a diversity of wildlife, and it became good for what then became very popular, which is pheasant shooting. So the woods near here are pheasant. They do keep pheasants, but they also are getting timber production as well. So it gets this diversity of habitat. Now, what I'm going to do is take you over to the other side and show you more the type of native forest for this particular area that would have been here before they started putting in the conifers. So I'm travelling up here through what is effectively boulder scree. You can probably see it's quite uneven, and what's happened here is there's some crags up above me, and this is actually an old volcanic extrusion. It's basalt, and it's gone bubbled up out of the ground effectively, obviously millions of years ago, and as it's eroded, the cliffs have started to obviously fall down and create these big boulder screes, and these become quite important in themselves, a different type of habitat. But obviously now it's become vegetated over and developed into a woodland. And what you can see up behind me is a few examples of some really quite nice big, or relatively big, oaks. And they're probably quite old because they're growing on quite difficult conditions in quite an exposed environment up on the side of the hill, but also in these rocky terrain with not so much soil. So obviously it takes them much longer to get established, and they'll never probably grow that big. But this is a good example of the type of woodland that would have been around this area, these mixed broadleaves without the conifers, which are the introduced species. So you can see here the remains of an old wall, and very often when the plantations were going in, they were going in on places where there maybe used to be grazing and fields. So they're not necessarily always all been woodland for a long time. The trees I was just showing you have been there for a long time. There's no walls, and probably they've never been disturbed that much because they're on that steep slope with all the rubble from the scree coming down. But here we've got the remains of a much older wall that obviously stretched all the way down here, and I can see remains of it going down the hill. So that could well have been there since the trees, well before the trees were planted. Or it may have been put in to help protect the planting of new trees. But very often that was more recent times and not necessarily using walling. And the other thing I wanted to just briefly show you here, we're quite busy up here today. It's a very popular walking area, and it's a good reason. It's a lovely walk up a hill, looking out across the Severn Valley actually, and we've got these beautiful habitats developing. The other thing that's often important in these areas is these ride sides. So what people are doing now is starting to manage these ride sides, because they become small grasslands in their own right, and you get this gradation from the track itself into the habitats at the side, and then into a bit of scrub, and then the woodland itself. So that gradation of habitat provides a lot more for wildlife, but it also is used quite often for helping with pheasants. And finally, I just wanted you to have a look at this area behind me. Now we're into an area which is almost totally conifer. Now this isn't very far from where we just were, but this is an example of what started to happen more and more. And this really got going after 1919 with the formation of the Forestry Commission and the start of trying to plant as much timber as possible following the devastation of timber being used in the First World War, and then obviously again a further boost following a lot being used in the Second World War here in the UK. So the Conifers had been starting to be used for 100, even 200 years in some estates, but in smaller quantities. But slowly they become used more and more. And then there was a real boost to that sort of post-war period, post-First World War period, when really started planting large quantities of conifer all in one go. And they were single species plantations very often, very dense. This is very open because this is being managed as part of an estate woodland. They've got different objectives than the just pure production of timber. There's other things that they probably want from the trees here on an estate. But the other thing is, when the people are managing conifers, they're looking, if you're managing them for timber rather than just sort of pulp and very quick turnaround, if you're growing the trees on to get good big timber trees, then you're looking to keep about a third of the tree, the top of the tree, green. So every 5 years, they used to thin them every 5 years just to keep that top of the trees green, slowly taking out more and more trees, so you're left with the best trees for the best timber production, but keeping them growing as fast as you possibly can. And that was the kind of rule of thumb. I mean, that's a very rough guide, but it helps you get a feel of what they're doing. So an older woodland will always be more open. However, as I say, this is part of an estate woodland, and if I just ask Ben to sort of turn as I finish speaking and look around behind us, you can see we move from this conifer block into an area where there's conifers and broadleafs, and it becomes mixed like the area we're in lower down. So woodland history and types of woodland, it's not as simple as just go in and say, is it an oak woodland, is it an ash woodland? It's this complexity, this diversity of different types of woodland that all are part of an ongoing story of how we've lived and worked with trees.